So we're going to do a review thread to be talking about The Mask and The Mask Returns by John Arcudi and Don Mahnke. Now, this is the way the creators of The Mask started it and how the character evolved into what they wanted was like the major anti-hero. Like, imagine the Joker who was a good guy, so to speak. And a character that really was very interesting because it kept evolving. And of course, the movie was made famous with the movie starring Jim Carrey called The Mask, and that was much more PG-13. But this is how the authors pictured the character would be. And of course, The Mask was the first one. This one was about how the mask enters the lives of modern-day America, so to speak, and the adventures that the people who put on the mask basically have. The second one, The Mask Returns, was the story of how, again, the mask was used and its manipulative elements and everything. But the second one is much more featurative of the major, so to speak, arch enemy of the mask, which was Walter, which I'll show later on. So that's what the story is about, and today we go through the same process to talk about the pros, the cons, and a conclusion. So let's get into it. Now, the first con of the book is obviously the fact that when you look at this, especially this cover here, you would think about the mask. If you're coming into this thinking about the mask from your childhood with Jim Carrey, the whole light-hearted fun, no one really gets super bloodied and everything, then you're going to be very much shocked because, you know, starting with the mask, the art style, as you can see here, is pretty much bloody, and it's not like a cartoony kind of art. There is that element of cartoony, but there is some serious elements to it. And as you can see here, bad things do happen to people and they don't exactly hide from it. The other thing about the book is, if you're the type that wants a very extensive backstory and origin story and all that, both books don't really address how the mask was created and everything like that. So it's much more left to interpretation. If you are in a completionist to wanting to find out everything like that from the comic itself, you're not going to get that with the mask. You know, they leave it a lot to interpretation, which I don't think is a bad thing, which I'll get to in the pros. And the last thing, of course, is some plot holes. You know, like, and amazingly, the plot holes don't really come with characters like the mask. It comes with characters like Walter, this character here, who basically, even the authors admit he was just made as a character that was superhuman, but he's supposed to be human. You know, he survives things like gunshot wounds and everything like that. And on top of that, there's some minor plot holes. It's like I said in the pros, but a very quick note, it's forgivable because the story is so good. So that's basically the flaws of the book. Not that many, to be absolutely honest. So let's get into the pros of the book. Now, the pros of the book, first thing is, of course, when you get this compilation set, you don't only just get the comic, or rather the collection of comic, you actually get the behind the mask story, you know, like actually came up with the character, you know, they even have a draft of how it's going to go and how, you know, throughout history, like this is how the mask was supposed to be in his first iteration. And of course he went on about how the story and how another artist actually took his how you say take on the mask for a series, and then how it evolved into this character right here. So you, for both books, in fact, you get this history of the mask, which is, like I say, you just add so much chrome, and because they explain the character, it makes you understand the character so much more. Like how they even omit certain things, like Walter, for example, like I talked about him being supposedly superhuman, but he's not, and how they said that you understand there is some realism issues with that, but as long as the story, how you say, supports that, people tend to accept it. And I got to say that I'm truthfully agree. Even before I read this part which they talk about Walter, I was totally in agreement with them about that point, that the story must carry the idea, such as they say that every story, alright, it must fit within the world. That's what they said. Like they say here, the mask can take all kind of damage and everything, so people already have a suspension of disbelief. And you know, if as long as, like with another character like Walter, you don't know why he's superhuman in terms of resistance and all that, but you accept it because the rest of the world still works, as long as you don't take it too far, you know, like basically don't make too many plot holes. And so with that idea carries the whole storyline of the mask, because you know, everything is played out with this superhuman character, but it still focuses on what's important, which is the mask and the people who wear the mask, which I'll get to in the morality of it and all. But the world itself works, you know. Everybody acts like people most of the time, you know, such as people who cheat others to make a buck, you know, that old lady, that, you know, the old teacher that used to bully you and all that. All right, and like example here, she's being taken out by the mask, or rather the person who's wearing the mask, and how she actually, you see, look at that, you know, she's actually pleading for help, you know. Or even like example right here, this is really interesting, like, you know, where they're fighting this character who's basically indestructible, but yet this cop, not knowing about that, pretends to be all brave because he thinks that later on he might get lucky with this particular character, this pretty blonde. Alright, and then gets himself blasted to pieces. But, you know, in real life, you know, you can see that this motivation right here, it was actually quite real, because it does happen. So the storyline is very much consistent. It's good. It focuses on what's important, which is the people who wear the mask, and does it well. So you focus on that, and you tend to forgive the plot holes even if they are apparent. And the important thing about the mask is, strangely as you notice, it starts with, of course, the titular character is Stanley Ipkiss right here, which of course you remember who the character that Jim Carrey played. And then it will move on to, you know, Calloway, who is basically the detective that goes after the mask, or rather the person they call Big Head. The next one to wear the mask is this low level mob thug who basically wears the mask and becomes the mob boss. And of course the last one to wear it is of course the pretty blonde. Alright, so that interesting thing is how I feel that the mask is such a great character, is that it is like authors kind of made it. They wanted the most anti-hero hero, like I said, the Joker basically, who is supposed to be a good guy, and is better than things like James Bond or those characters over the years which you get different actors to play, which I feel really can make a good franchise. Is because the mask doesn't matter who is the character. The character can change with every single person who puts on the mask, and their moralities and everything change based on who's wearing the mask, which is excellent. Because imagine if doesn't like James Bond with the latest one, can't remember his name all of a sudden, but the big issue when he took on the role that he was blonde. All right, but with the mask it doesn't matter, as long as you have the green face, that's the most important thing. And like I said, the focus on the characters and each of their moralities is interesting. Like example with the character change, when the little mob underling wears the mask, he basically goes on rampage and he kills, you know, anybody to get to his goal, which is to become the most powerful gang boss around and everything. And he kills, and there's an article which they have where he, in his fighting, he kills children, you know. I mean, they were side casualties, but he doesn't care who he hurts. Whereas compared to when Calloway wears the mask, you know, he's basically just a good cop who never wants to hurt anybody. In fact, many times when he takes off the mask, he's asking that did he murder anyone, and how he basically just wanted to clean up the streets, you know, from all the drug dealers and everything who were basically bribing their way out of jail and punishment, basically. And so each of the characters go through the mask, but what they find at the end is always that the mask is the one that's slowly manipulating them, when they always feel that they are in control. In fact, there's a part in the second book where she puts on the mask, and the first thing she says is that I'm still in control. And from what each of the characters, as you read the book, you'll find out is that the mask is inherently evil, and it is up to the person wearing it to basically try to control the mask in a way, but you're never really going to succeed. The best thing you can always do is actually not wear the mask, because it's manipulative at best. And so this leads into an important kind of comparison. Like, to me, the mask is indicative of the One Ring. Alright, the One Ring is something that everybody talks about, that how it's all this great powerful thing in Tolkien's world. But and again, I've not read the books, but I saw the movies and I read some synopsis on it. The One Ring doesn't seem to have, other than the invisibility power, All right, I mean I know that you say that it has a lot of background power. It affects people's minds and everything like that, but it's not outwardly powerful. You know, when you see it's just a ring and everything like that. Whereas the mask is just when you wear it, you see it. You see the power of the mask. So it's very hard not to put your faith in it. You know, like you see all these characters when they get in a bad situation, they put on the mask because it makes them invulnerable. It makes them the superhero, so to speak. And when you see it so clearly, how the mask gets blasted to pieces and how he always manages to survive. And on top of that, how as you can see, one of his powers, he can make just things appear and make things like even a baseball into a missile, stuff like that. It just feels much more believable than the One Ring. As a reason why is that people just can't give it up. It's not just that like the One Ring is always like, oh, because it affects your mind, but with the mask it doesn't even need to affect your mind, even though it does when you're not wearing it. But just innately human that you don't give up this such a powerful thing, which is the problem throughout the whole two books, is that people can easily just get rid of the mask and just basically stop the cycle, but they can't because the power is so, how you say, alluring. And so the book concentrated that most important thing is how each of the characters handle the morality of the mask, and how also that from each character to character it shows that how each person with their own views on how the goals of their life and all that, how the mask kind of brings out the worst in, or either even in good intentions bad things happen, how basically the mask affects a certain sense of morality, so you can actually compare from each character to each character, which is really fascinating. And another pro of the book, of course, is the character that the two authors said that they needed. Every character needs an arch-nemesis. It's just the way it is, you know, and if done well, that rivalry really brings on a whole new kind of world to this character and his world. And so with Batman, you got the Joker, Superman, you got Lex Luthor. In the case of the mask, you have Walter right here. And I like the fact that they said that, you know, they didn't want either the mask or Walter to be just inherently, how you say, black and white. You know, like with Walter, he is the epitome and everything that's kind of opposite of the mask. He's inherently very large, as you can see. You know, he just towers over people. He's very quiet compared to the mask, who's most on average height. The mask usually makes your character very loud, very obnoxious, so to speak. Think of the Jim Carrey, like how he's very high pitched and all that. At the same time, he's supposed to be bad, but he keeps his promises to the word. You know, if he says he'll stand by you, he'll stand by you. And you know, later on you can see that he actually has a tattoo of mother. So they, you know, like that in the front of the book, of this book, they talked about how a guy who loves his mother, but in essence he's still a bad guy, so to speak. They basically play off each other, and he is the only human that can stand up to the mask toe to toe, because he doesn't ever seem to die. Alright, you know, just like this line here, when are you going to die? He takes flamethrower hits, grenade hits, whatever, he doesn't affect him. You know, I mean, it affects him. You can see with all his body scars and it, but somehow he just seems to have this ability that no one can explain. And even with someone so quiet, it's amazing how they give him so much character. Like I say, that thing that he's not black and white, you know. It's kind of weird because even just reading Walter, I don't hate him. You know, he does very bad things, but he doesn't seem to do it out of malice. You know, he just kind of just going around. And on top of that, when you read him, you tend to want to make sense of the character, because like I say, when a story is good, you want to make sense of it. And what I came up with Walter is actually like some people, how they are born with, you know, a lack of nerves in their body, so they don't even know they're being hurt. So maybe that's why Walter has this ability to, you know, take pain on such a level. You know, like right here, where he, you know, he's just talking to a mafia boss and he can just cut himself with no pain, you know. And this part reminded me of documentary which they talk about someone who was born, or rather had an accident, and he couldn't, his nerves were affected, and how, you know, just for a simple act of doing something like that, he doesn't know, he can't, because his nerves are weak, he didn't know it, and by the end of the day, he had been doing it so long that he would actually gouge a hole in himself. So same thing, maybe Walter has no nerves, for all I know, you know. And again, how I came up with that conclusion is because I actually cared for the characters and made me think, which is again a very huge plus for the story and the people who wrote the story, and the artist, of course, which, you know, look at that, you can see the expression of Walter's face, like he's actually shocked, like what's the big deal with all the blood and all. And I like how that they know no one in the world here knows they can stop Walter, because even this most powerful gang boss with hundreds of policemen under him, which many times he tried to use against the mask, would not dare touch Walter. And like I said, the good thing about the book is that they concentrate on the characters wearing the mask and everything, and the mask itself is just a tool to facilitate storytelling. And because they leave it open to interpretation, they don't leave themselves that huge problem with comic characters nowadays, which is so much backstory and everything, that everything you do somehow contradicts the old backstory, like with Superman and all that. And so I like it that they kept it somewhat open, but at the same time, I like the fact that they do give some backstory. The book would have been fine without it, but it's nice that they were showing where, give you a bit of snippet. Like over here you can see that the mask basically came from what you can see is some maybe South African or South American nation, and you can see that these guys are wearing modern day clothes, so it's from maybe a cult somewhere or something like that. So is it from Satan or whatever? You don't know. But the fact that they give you this little part leaves you a point like, here's the strange thing. At the end of the book, you really want to find out more of the mask. The fact that they give you this little, really short snippet of where the mask comes from and how they got to America makes you want to find out more, which is what I did when I first read the book, and years later I'm still looking. So in conclusion, The Mask and The Mask Returns, excellent book. When I was packing, I got rid of a lot of comics. These two were two books which I was never going to throw, and I'm still going to keep them because I thoroughly enjoyed myself reading them. In fact, we finished them I'm a slow reader, but I finished them really, really fast. The time reading is just like it whiz past. And one was before The Mask became famous, and the other, this compilation was, I think, was released after the Jim Carrey movie. And how the fact that the history inside also lets you know about how the character came about, and they also talk about the movie, about how the character changed from the movie to be PG-13 and everything. But that in itself was a standalone thing for The Mask, like think alternate universe kind of thing. But this Mask is how they pictured it. So an excellent compilation. I really feel if you can find it, you should get it. So thank you very much. Till next word.